Guitar by the windowsill, the weight of the wood and wire. In the years before the world shrunk into the palm of a hand, time moved to the steady, physical rhythm of a ticking metronome and the heavy scent of polished mahogany. For Francis, life was measured in measures. He was a creature born of the stave, moving through the echoing corridors of the university's music department with the quiet, unassuming grace of a man who preferred to let the ivory keys speak for him. At 21, Francis was already an anomaly. While other young men his age chased the loud, distorted rebellion of late-night garage rock, Francis belonged to the sacred, disciplined geometry of choral arrangements. He was the anchor of the university sanctuary choir. To the student body, he was a ghost in a pressed white shirt. To the faculty, he was indispensable. Whenever the master conductor, Professor Elena Vance, was delayed by administrative boards or traffic, she didn't send an assistant instructor. She sent for Francis. "Give them the A-minor scale, Francis," she would tell him, her voice cracking with the authority of 30 years on the podium. "Keep their diaphragms engaged. Don't let the tenors drag." And Francis would sit at the great Steinway grand piano, his long fingers finding the keys with an effortless, blind precision. He would lead the warm-ups, his sharp ear catching the slightest flat note in a sea of 40 voices. He was respected, deeply so, and quietly adored from afar. Girls from the soprano section would often linger by the piano after practice, offering him home-baked pastries or inventing sudden difficulties with their sight reading just to have him lean close and play the measure correctly. Francis was always polite, always patient, but his heart remained as locked and silent as a closed piano lid. He wasn't looking for a muse among the eager faces. He was waiting for a voice he hadn't heard yet. Then came the afternoon of the mid-semester auditions. The air in the rehearsal hall was thick with nervous tension and the sharp tang of throat lozenges. The sanctuary choir was a prestigious institution, backed by a generous endowment that granted full tuition scholarships to its members, a lifeline for struggling students in an era where an education was a hard-fought luxury. The panel consisted of Professor Vance, 2 senior vocal instructors, and Francis, who sat at the end of the long oak table, a freshly sharpened pencil in hand and a stack of blank evaluation sheets before him. For 2 hours, a parade of pristine, technically flawless voices marched through the room. They sang classical art songs and traditional hymns, their posture rigid, their expressions strained with the desperate desire to please. Francis marked his sheets methodically: soprano, good breath control, slight vibrato issues in the upper register. Alto, clear tone but lacks projection. It was mechanical. It was exhausting. Then the heavy oak doors swung open and Nicole walked in. She didn't look like the others. She didn't carry a binder of sheet music pressed against her chest like a shield. Instead, she carried a battered, lacquer-worn acoustic guitar, its strap slung over her shoulder like a companion she couldn't bear to leave behind. She wore a simple canvas skirt and a faded blouse, her dark hair pinned back hastily with a plastic clip. A collective, subtle shift occurred among the older faculty members. Professor Vance lowered her reading glasses, her eyes instantly fixing on the instrument. "An acoustic guitar, Miss Nicole," she said, her voice small but steady. "Nicole Reyes, ma'am." "Miss Reyes," Vance sighed, a touch of academic weariness bleeding into her tone. "This is an audition for the classical sanctuary choir. We do not utilize folk instruments here. Did you bring a selection from the approved repertoire list?" "I don't have sheet music for a pianist, ma'am," Nicole replied, her hand instinctively coming to rest on the neck of her guitar, her fingers curling around the frets. "But I can sing The Water Is Wide." Francis watched her closely. While the rest of the panel looked skeptical, he noticed her hands. The tips of her fingers on her left hand were heavily calloused, rough and flattened from hours of brutal, unyielding practice. This wasn't a girl who played 3 chords at a campfire. Those were the hands of someone who labored over the strings until they bled, who stayed up into the quiet hours of the night chasing a perfect tone through sheer, stubborn repetition. Nicole possessed an ear developed not by privilege, but by the grueling, self-imposed discipline of a true craftsman. "Very well," Vance said, waving a hand. "A cappella, if you please." Nicole slung the guitar around to her back, looking suddenly vulnerable without the wooden body protecting her chest. She took a breath, closed her eyes, and began to sing. Her voice was sweet, carrying a natural, honest warmth that immediately cut through the sterile academic air of the hall. She held the tune perfectly, her pitch unswerving. Yet, as the verses progressed, Francis felt a tug of frustration. She was holding back. Her shoulders were tense, her chin tucked slightly downward, her voice trapped inside her own throat. She was singing to the floor, her projection muted as if she were terrified of taking up too much space in the room. When she finished, she opened her eyes, looking directly at the table. Professor Vance looked down at her notes, already drawing a neat, devastating line through Nicole's name. "Thank you, Miss Reyes. Excellent pitch. But the placement is far too small for a hall of this size. The sanctuary choir requires a robust, operatic projection. I'm afraid you aren't a fit for our vocal profile." The other two instructors nodded in silent agreement. Nicole's face paled slightly, her hand tightening on the strap of her guitar. The scholarship was slipping away before she had even truly crossed the threshold. Suddenly, Francis spoke up. It was a rare occurrence. Usually, he deferred entirely to Vance's authority during auditions. "Professor," Francis said, his voice quiet but carrying a distinct weight that made the older woman pause, "if I may." He turned his eyes directly to Nicole. For a split second, their gazes locked, and Francis felt an inexplicable electric jolt in his chest. He knew it wasn't a logical deduction, it was a sudden, violent certainty that this girl belonged in his world. "Miss Reyes," Francis said gently, "bring your guitar to the front, play the song again. But this time I want you to sing while you play, do not separate yourself from the instrument." Professor Vance frowned. "Francis, really, we don't have time for folk arrangements. Please, Professor," Francis insisted, his eyes never leaving Nicole. "Just one verse." Nicole looked at Francis, a flicker of profound gratitude washing over her features. She quickly swung the guitar back around, settling the curved body against her thigh. She took a deep breath, and the moment her right hand struck the first chord, a transformation occurred that left the room spellbound. The guitar didn't just accompany her, it anchored her. The rich, resonant wood against her ribs seemed to unlock something deep within her chest. As she strummed a beautiful, rolling fingerstyle pattern, her head lifted. She looked up at the high, vaulted ceiling of the music room, opened her mouth, and sang. It was as if an angel had suddenly taken flight in the room. The voice that had been small and timid moments before was now expansive, radiant, and dripping with raw, crystalline emotion. The guitar provided a safety net, a familiar terrain that allowed her soul to soar without fear. The notes filled every corner of the room, vibrating against the glass of the high windows. When the final chord faded into a sustained, beautiful whisper of steel strings, the room was utterly silent. Professor Vance sat frozen, her pen hovering an inch above the paper. The two senior instructors looked at each other, their mouths slightly open. Francis didn't look at his papers, he just looked at Nicole, a small, knowing smile touching his lips. Professor Vance cleared her throat, her academic armor thoroughly cracked. She looked at Francis, then back to Nicole. "Well, it seems my assistant conductor has a keener ear today than I do. The panel unanimously accepts you into the sanctuary choir, Miss Reyes. Welcome aboard." The architecture of harmony, the transition from a solitary acoustic singer to a disciplined choral vocalist, was a steep, agonizing hill to climb, and Nicole found herself stumbling almost immediately. The sanctuary choir practiced 4 days a week in the Old West Wing of the conservatory. It was a world governed by strict rules. There were no instruments allowed in the risers. Voices had to blend seamlessly, like water mixing with water, until individual identities were swallowed by the collective harmony. For Nicole, this was like being asked to walk across a high wire without her balancing pole. Without the weight of her guitar against her body, she felt naked. When she stood on the risers during the first week of official rehearsals, her voice faltered, reverting to the timid, closed-off whisper that had almost cost her the audition. Soprano twos. "You are dragging again," Professor Vance snapped during a Thursday afternoon rehearsal, her baton tapping sharply against the music stand. "And someone in the middle is completely swallowed by the alto line. Project, support from the diaphragm." Nicole bit her lip, her eyes burning with frustration. She knew she was the weak link. She could feel the subtle, annoyed glances from the seasoned scholarship students around her. When the rehearsal finally ended and the choir members began packing away their folders, Professor Vance called out across the room, "Francis, stay behind for a moment, and Miss Reyes, please step down to the piano." Nicole's heart sank. She walked down the wooden steps of the risers, holding her music folder tightly against her chest. Francis was already standing by the grand piano, his expression calm, though his eyes held a deep, observant focus as he watched her approach. "Miss Reyes," Professor Vance said, adjusting her coat, "you have a magnificent instrument inside you, but right now it is locked behind a door. You are entirely dependent on that guitar of yours. If you cannot learn to project independently, I cannot keep you on the scholarship roster for next semester. Francis has volunteered to be your personal mentor. You will spend an hour after every rehearsal working with him on vocal independence. Understood?" "Yes, Professor," Nicole whispered, looking down at her shoes. Once the heavy doors closed and the room emptied, leaving only the two of them in the vast, shadow-drenched rehearsal hall, the silence became heavy. Nicole felt a sudden wave of embarrassment. She walked over to the corner of the room where her guitar case lay, leaning against the wall beneath the large, arched windows. "You don't need to feel ashamed, Nicole," Francis said, his voice remarkably gentle as he sat down on the piano bench. "I feel stupid," she admitted, walking back to him but keeping her distance. "When I have my guitar, I know exactly where the notes are. I can feel them in my fingers before I sing them. Without it, I feel like I'm falling." "Then let's teach you how to fly without a parachute," Francis said, a warm smile breaking through his usual quiet demeanor. "Come here, stand right by the curve of the piano." She moved closer, her heart doing a strange, fluttering dance that had absolutely nothing to do with vocal scales. Francis was older, possessing a quiet authority and a deep, soul-stirring passion for music that she had never encountered in any guy her age. "The guitar is your shield," Francis explained, striking a single, clear C major chord on the piano. "You hide behind the strums, you use the rhythm to mask your breathing. I want you to look at me. Don't look at the keys, don't look at the floor. Look at my eyes." Nicole swallowed hard, lifting her chin. She looked into his eyes. They were a deep, intense dark brown, filled with an absolute, unwavering belief in her. "Now match my breath," Francis instructed. He took a deep, deliberate breath, his chest expanding smoothly. Nicole copied him. "Good, now give me a straight, sustained tone on an R vowel. No vibrato, no guitar, just raw air and vocal chord. Go." Nicole began to sing the note. It wobbled initially, her shoulders tensing. "No, don't drop your chin," Francis commanded softly, standing up from the bench. He stepped closer, his presence warm and overwhelming. He reached out, his long, warm fingers gently touching the underside of her jaw, tilting her head slightly upward. The contact sent a jolt of heat straight down her spine. "Keep the space in the back of your throat open, like you're holding a warm egg. Try again." With his hand gently guiding her posture, Nicole took another breath. She looked directly into his eyes, anchoring herself to his gaze instead of her guitar strings. She sang the note. This time it came out clear, vibrant, and perfectly resonant, echoing beautifully against the high ceilings. "There," Francis whispered, his face just inches from hers, his hand still lingering lightly on her jaw. "Do you hear that? That's your voice, Nicole. It doesn't belong to the guitar. It belongs to you." A flush of crimson crept up Nicole's cheeks. Francis realized how close he was standing and slowly lowered his hand, clearing his throat as a rare, endearing look of flustered nervousness crossed his features. Over the next 2 months, the post-rehearsal hour became the center of their universe. Slowly, methodically, Francis dismantled her dependence on the instrument. He taught her how to stand with her weight distributed evenly, how to project her voice to the farthest corner of the balcony, and how to find the internal pitch without needing a steel string to guide her. Under his careful, devoted guidance, Nicole's confidence soared. By the midterm performance, she wasn't just blending into the soprano section. She was anchoring it, her powerful, angelic voice drawing praise from Professor Vance herself. Yet, despite her growth, a part of Nicole remained fiercely loyal to her roots. She still preferred the storytelling intimacy of the guitar. To her, the choir was classical discipline, but the guitar was her diary. Because of this, she still carried her instrument everywhere. During the chaotic 30-minute lunch breaks between general lectures and choir practices, while the other students gossiped in the cafeteria or studied in the library, Nicole would retreat to the empty West Wing music room. She would pull her guitar from its worn canvas case, sit cross-legged on the wide wooden bench beneath the large arched windows, and sing her own songs, melodies she composed in the dark of her bedroom, far removed from the strict Latin hymns of the sanctuary choir. And Francis, under the pretense of organizing sheet music or checking the piano tuning, was always there, watching her from the shadows of the stage, falling deeper and deeper into a love he knew he wasn't allowed to declare. The secret in the sound hole, the unwritten laws of the conservatory were clear, but the written ones were absolute. Page 4 of the University Sanctuary Choir Handbook stated, in a stark, unyielding serif font, to maintain academic focus and artistic unity, romantic fraternization between choir members or between student leaders and choir members is strictly prohibited. Violation of this policy will result in immediate suspension and forfeiture of all scholarship funding. In an era when a long-distance call required an operator and a message took days to cross town by mail, secrecy required a physical architecture. For Francis and Nicole, that architecture became the empty rehearsal hall during the late autumn afternoons. By November, the autumn chill had settled deep into the stone walls of the music wing. The heavy radiator beneath the western arched window clanked and hissed, throwing off a dry, comforting heat that smelled faintly of old dust and pipe steam. Nicole had taken to practicing there during the quiet hour between the end of history lectures and the beginning of the evening choral block. It began on a Tuesday. Nicole was sitting on the wide wooden sill, her back pressed against the frame where the glass was cold, her guitar resting on her knees. She was working on a fingerstyle pattern, her brow furrowed as she tried to master a difficult transition between a B minor and an F-sharp 7th chord. Francis entered quietly, carrying a stack of leather-bound hymnals. He didn't say a word to disrupt her focus. He walked to the window, took a small, folded piece of cream-colored paper from his breast pocket, and held it out. Nicole looked up, her fingers freezing on the strings. "What's this?" "Read it when you get home," Francis said, his voice a low whisper that barely carried across the empty rows of seats. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she took the paper. It was thick, heavy stock, folded neatly into a small square. With a quick, nervous glance toward the heavy oak doors of the hall, she slipped the note through the circular sound hole of her guitar. It dropped onto the dark interior wood with a soft, dry rustle, sliding beneath the steel strings where no passing eye could ever spot it. That night, in the cramped bedroom of the boarding house she shared with 3 other girls, Nicole used a plastic guitar pick to gently guide the paper back out through the sound hole. She unfolded it by the yellow light of a small desk lamp. "Nicole, when you sing the 3rd movement of the Bach piece during practice, your voice carries a quality that the others cannot match. It isn't just pitch, it is life. I find myself struck by how the room changes when you open your mouth. I know the risks we face. I know what the scholarship means to your future. But every chord I strike on the piano now feels like a question, and your voice is the only answer that makes sense." The next afternoon, when Nicole arrived for practice, she didn't leave her guitar case closed on the floor. She lifted the instrument out, walked directly to the western window, and placed it flat on the wide sill, the sound hole facing upward like an open palm. Francis, arriving 20 minutes before the rest of the choir to set the conductor's podium, walked past the window. Without breaking his stride, his hand dipped low, and a new square of paper slipped between the strings, disappearing into the dark, fragrant hollow of the cedar top. The windowsill became their dead drop. It was a perfect, silent code. The presence of the guitar on the wood, bathed in the pale afternoon light filtering through the glass, meant that all was well between them. It meant I am here, I am yours, and I am listening. The silent windowsill for 3 months, the system was flawless. They grew adept at the double life. On the risers, they were the disciplined assistant conductor and the dedicated soprano, communicating only through formal nods and the precise timing of musical entries. But inside the guitar, a library of devotion was growing. Francis wrote of the music he dreamed of composing. Nicole wrote of the melodies that kept her awake at night. But love, even when hidden inside the body of an instrument, leaves an acoustic footprint. In early February, a subtle tension began to creep into their stolen moments. The pressure of the upcoming mid-year showcase was weighing heavily on Francis. He was shorter with his directions during rehearsals, his usual patience frayed by a tenor section that refused to master their intervals. During a Wednesday session, he had stopped the entire choir solely to correct Nicole's timing on a syncopated measure, a correction that felt uncharacteristically harsh in front of 40 peers. Nicole had flushed deep red, her pride stung. The next afternoon, Francis walked into the rehearsal room early, his pocket heavy with a letter of apology he had spent half the night writing. He looked toward the western window, expecting to see the familiar silhouette of the mahogany body against the glass. The sill was bare. Nicole was in the room, but she was sitting on the far side of the hall, her guitar strapped tight to her shoulder, her fingers furiously practicing a classical exercise. She didn't look up when he entered. Francis felt a cold dread settle in his stomach. He moved toward the piano, his chest tight. He couldn't speak to her directly. 3 other choir members had just walked through the door, laughing and unbuttoning their winter coats. He had no way to explain, no way to reach her. The code had flipped. The empty windowsill was a wall of absolute silence. It took 2 days of agonizing distance before Nicole finally relented. On Friday afternoon, touched by the miserable, exhausted look on Francis's face as he sat at the piano, she walked over to the window during the mid-practice intermission and laid the guitar down on the wood. Francis caught the movement from the corner of his eye. Relief washed over him so violently he nearly miskeyed the chord he was demonstrating to a baritone. The moment the room cleared for the dinner break, he crossed the floor and dropped his letter into the sound hole. They had survived their first storm, but the vulnerability of their code had been exposed. The guitar by the windowsill was a beacon, not just for Francis, but for anyone who knew how to read the geography of the room. The intruder's receipt, the betrayal, did not arrive with a loud confrontation. It arrived with the smell of cheap lavender perfume and the cold snap of a trap closing. On a rainy Tuesday in late February, Nicole hurried into the music wing. The downpour had dampened the hem of her skirt, and she was eager to place her guitar by the window before the hall filled with students escaping the weather. She laid the instrument on the sill, noted that Francis hadn't arrived yet, and ran down the hall to the restroom to dry her hair with a paper towel. When she returned 10 minutes later, the room was still empty, the rain lashing hard against the glass. She walked to the window to check her instrument. As she lifted the guitar, she felt a strange weight inside. It wasn't the light, crisp rattle of Francis's usual small squares of paper. This was heavy, thick, and modern. Heart racing, she sat on the bench and tilted the guitar, shaking it until a large, brown manila envelope forced its way through the strings. Her name was written on the front in sharp, aggressive cursive letters using violet ink. Nicole tore the envelope open. Inside was a single sheet of lined paper, wrapped around a small bundle of photocopies and a glossy Polaroid photograph. Nicole, you think you are clever, leaving your little wooden box by the window every day. You think no one notices how Francis looks at you from the piano bench. You are a fool. Francis belongs to me. He has belonged to me long before a girl from the provinces with an old guitar showed up trying to steal a free education. He writes to me too. He tells me everything. If you think I'm lying, look at the receipts. Nicole's breath caught in her throat. She pulled out the photocopies. They were copies of handwritten letters. The handwriting was undeniably Francis's, with his characteristic elegant, slanting script and the distinct way he crossed his capital T's. The words were intimate, full of promises and declarations of a shared future. Then she looked at the Polaroid. It was dark, taken in a crowded local diner down the street from the campus. It showed Francis sitting in a booth, leaning close to a girl whose face was turned away from the camera, his hand resting near hers on the table. The final lines of the letter stabbed deep into her chest. Professor Vance knows my family well. If I bring the originals of his letters to her, and if I tell her what you two have been doing in the music room after hours, your scholarship will be cancelled by noon tomorrow. You'll be packed up and on a bus home before the weekend. If you want to keep your precious future, you will back off. Never place your guitar by that window again. Never speak to him outside of practice. If I see him touch your hand or look at you for too long, the professor gets the file. Consider this your only warning. The room seemed to tilt. The ambient noise of the rain outside turned into a deafening roar in Nicole's ears. Her scholarship wasn't just a financial aid package. It was her family's entire hope. Her father had worked extra shifts at the mill just to afford her train fare to the city. Her mother had saved for a year to buy her the very guitar she held in her lap. If she lost the choir, she lost everything. She looked at the photocopies of Francis's words to this mysterious woman. The betrayal stung worse than the threat of expulsion. Had it all been a game to him? Was she just another voice he wanted to train and control, while his real life belonged to someone else in the shadows? The heavy doors of the hall creaked open. Students began to trickle in, shaking their umbrellas. Nicole didn't cry. With cold, trembling fingers, she shoved the envelope into her satchel. She took her guitar off the windowsill, placed it back into its canvas case, and zipped it shut with a harsh, final metallic snap. When Francis entered the room 5 minutes later, his eyes immediately leaped to the western window. The sill was empty, and as he looked across the room, searching for her face, Nicole looked right through him, her eyes as cold and vacant as a winter sky. The language of open mics. The silence that followed was absolute, a heavy, suffocating wall that Francis could neither break nor understand. For 3 weeks, Nicole became a ghost in the soprano section. She arrived exactly when the rehearsal bell rang, stood perfectly still on the high risers, and left through the side doors the moment Professor Vance dismissed the group. She never looked at the piano. When Francis deliberately tried to catch her after practice to schedule their regular mentoring sessions, she simply stated, in front of 2 other students, "I don't require the extra help anymore, Francis. My projection is stable." "Thank you." Francis was losing his mind. He spent his nights pacing his small apartment, reviewing every word he had ever said to her, every gesture, wondering what mistake had caused her to lock him out so completely. He left 3 different letters on the western windowsill, but they sat there until the evening janitor moved them. Nicole never even looked at the wood. But while her voice was silent in the conservatory, it was finding a dangerous, revolutionary new outlet elsewhere. Nicole had realized very quickly that she couldn't live under the threat of the violet-ink letter forever. The choir scholarship was a cage, and the mysterious woman held the key to the lock. If she wanted to be free, she had to build her own floor beneath her feet. On a rainy Saturday night, far away from the academic judgment of the university campus, Nicole walked into the Gilded Cord, a dim, smoky basement coffee house in the old district of the city. It was a place where writers, poets, and acoustic musicians gathered to share raw, unpolished works before a crowd that cared little for classical credentials. The air smelled of roasted espresso beans, stale tobacco, and wet wool. A single spotlight illuminated a small wooden stage where a microphone stood, connected to a small, slightly buzzing amplifier. Next up on the open mic, the master of ceremonies announced, clapping his hands together, "We have a newcomer. Let's give a warm welcome to Nicole." Nicole walked up the steps, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm. This wasn't the sanctuary choir. There were no sheets of music, no Latin phrases, no Professor Vance to guide her diaphragm. It was just her, her battered guitar, and a room full of strangers. She adjusted the microphone stand, her fingers cold. She settled the guitar against her ribs, and the familiar weight immediately calmed the trembling in her chest. She looked out at the faces in the dim light, people looking for truth, not perfection. She didn't sing a hymn. She struck a low, echoing E minor chord that vibrated through the floorboards and began to strum a rhythm that felt like rain falling on a tin roof. She had spent the last 2 weeks writing her heart into the wood. Verse 1, "There's a place where the cedar meets the stone, where the cold glass keeps the secrets we had known. I left my heart by the western glass, waiting for the shadows of the day to pass. But the wind brought a letter in a stranger's hand, built on a foundation made of shifting sand." Chorus, "And the guitar by the windowsill stays in its case tonight. No more secret verses by the pale afternoon light. You carved your promises into my skin, but I won't let the shadow of your choices in. Yeah, the guitar by the windowsill is quiet now. I'm learning how to sing without your vow." The room went entirely still. The raw, crystalline power of her voice, stripped of the operatic restraints Francis had taught her to use, was devastatingly honest. It carried the weight of real heartbreak, the grit of a woman who was fighting for her own survival. When she finished the final chord, letting it ring out until it was swallowed by the hum of the amplifier, the basement erupted into loud, genuine applause. People banged their coffee mugs against the tables, poets snapped their fingers. Nicole stepped back from the microphone, a sudden, intoxicating rush of realization hitting her. She didn't need the sanctuary choir to exist. She didn't need Francis to tell her how to fly. This room, this community of misfits and late-night dreamers, was an alternative path. It was a way to earn enough from weekend gigs to pay her own tuition, to break the chains of the scholarship before the anonymous writer could ever pull them tight. Week after week, she returned to the Gilded Cord and 2 other small venues in the neighboring districts. Word began to spread about the young woman with the acoustic guitar who sang the heartbreaking song about a hidden romance and a broken code. Guitar by the Windowsill became her signature piece, a song always requested, an anthem for anyone who had ever loved someone in the dangerous, fragile spaces of the dark. The response from the organ, by the arrival of late March, Nicole's weekends had become a blur of dim spotlights and the heavy scent of espresso. She had managed to secure a regular rotation at the Gilded Chord, and the small cash tips she collected in her velvet-lined guitar case was slowly accumulating in a tin box beneath her bed. It wasn't a fortune yet, but it was a countdown to freedom. With another month of gigs, she would have enough to cover the next term's tuition independently. The anonymous threat with the violet ink would lose its teeth. On weekdays, she remained a perfect, unreadable statue on the choir risers, executing every note with cold, flawless precision. Francis had stopped trying to approach her. He looked hollowed out, dark circles bruising the skin beneath his eyes, his performance at the piano strictly mechanical. He had accepted the silence, even if it was killing him. On a rainy Saturday night, the Gilded Chord was packed to the brick walls. The damp weather had driven the city's artists and students underground, filling every bench and stool. Nicole took the stage for her second set, the room warming instantly as she launched into her repertoire. When she reached her final song, she didn't need to announce it. A few people in the front row began to snap their fingers in recognition as her right hand initiated the rolling, rhythmic intro of Guitar by the Windowsill. She sang it with a hardened confidence now, the initial pain of the lyrics forged into something fiercely independent. As she struck the final, resonant chord and stepped back from the microphone, the applause was deafening. She smiled, bowing slightly, and began to unstrap her guitar to clear the stage for the next act. Then, the ambient noise of the coffee house shifted. The master of ceremonies didn't walk up to the microphone. Instead, a tall figure stepped out from the shadows near the back exit, moving purposefully toward the corner of the stage where an old, dust-covered electric reed organ sat, an instrument rarely touched by the folk acts. Nicole's breath caught in her throat. Her hands froze on her guitar strap. It was Francis. He wore his damp wool coat, his hair slightly wild from the rain outside. He didn't look at the crowd, and he didn't look at Nicole. He sat down heavily on the wooden organ bench, switched on the internal blower, which started up with a low, mechanical hum, and pressed his fingers into the keys. A rich, sweeping wave of minor chords flooded the basement, completely different from the light acoustic tones that usually filled the room. The organ possessed a heavy, church-like weight that immediately commanded absolute silence. The chatter at the tables died instantly. Francis adjusted the microphone attached to the organ console. He took a deep breath, his eyes finally lifting. He looked directly at Nicole, who stood paralyzed at the edge of the stage, her guitar pressed against her chest like a shield. Then Francis began to sing. He had never sung solo in front of the choir. He had always been the guide, the accompanist, the silent force behind the piano. His voice was a rich, soaring baritone, deep, commanding, and laced with a raw, agonizing desperation that made the air in the room feel thin. He had heard her song. He had found her in the dark, and this was his reply. Verse 1, I heard your voice through the basement floor, singing of secrets and a closing door. You speak of a letter, of a broken trust, of promises turned into ash and dust. But the hand that wrote those twisted lines was spinning a web of dark designs. She watches from shadows, a ghost in the hall, trying to build an unbreakable wall. Chorus, but the letters in the wood were only for you. Every chord that I strike is honest and true. No receipts in the dark, no love that I shared with a desperate soul who was never preferred. I brought the law to her doorstep today to chase the illusions and shadows away. And I'd give up the choir, the keys, and the hill to see your guitar by the windowsill. The lyrics cut through the room like a scalpel. Francis detailed the truth without a single shred of academic restraint. He sang of the deranged admirer, a student who had stalked his movements, intercepted his life, and fabricated an entire history out of stolen handwriting samples and a single non-consensual photograph taken at a public diner where he had explicitly tried to reject her advances. He sang of the legal injunction he had filed that very morning, forcing the stalker into the light of the university administration and ensuring she would never threaten anyone again. He sang of his sorrow for letting the madness touch Nicole. He sang of his willingness to walk away from everything, the prestigious choir, his position, his own scholarship, if it meant she could breathe without fear. When the final, heavy organ chord vibrated through the floorboards and slowly decayed into silence, Francis didn't wait for the applause. He shut off the blower, stood up from the bench, and walked straight out the back exit into the pouring rain, leaving the room completely spellbound. Nicole stood in the quiet, a single tear finally breaking free and tracing a hot path down her cheek. The wall of ice she had built over her heart hadn't just cracked, it had completely shattered. The return of the code, the Sunday morning sun broke through the storm clouds, casting sharp, brilliant beams of light across the university campus. The stone corridors of the music wing were quiet, carrying only the distant, muffled sound of the early morning chapel bells. Nicole arrived an hour before the official sanctuary choir rehearsal was scheduled to begin. Her canvas guitar case felt lighter in her hand, the heavy burden of suspicion and fear entirely lifted from its frame. She walked down the long, empty hallway, her footsteps echoing against the high ceilings. She pushed open the heavy oak doors of the main rehearsal hall. The room was flooded with morning light, the dust motes dancing in the brilliant yellow streams cutting through the high windows. She walked directly to the western side of the room. The large, arched window was clean, the glass still holding a few lingering droplets of last night's rain. With slow, deliberate movements, Nicole unzipped her case, lifted her acoustic guitar into the light, and laid it flat on the wide wooden sill. The cedar top gleamed in the sun, the sound hole faced upward, open and waiting. The code was restored. 30 minutes later, the side door opened, and Francis walked in. Carrying his leather folder of choral scores, he looked exhausted, his shoulders slightly hunched as if preparing himself for another day of agonizing distance. He didn't look up immediately. He walked toward the piano, his mind clearly trapped in the echoes of the previous night. Then his eyes instinctively flicked toward the western window. Francis froze, his breath hitched in his throat. The mahogany body of the guitar was sitting precisely where it belonged. Bathed in the gold of the morning sun, he dropped his music folder onto the piano bench with a loud, chaotic clatter of papers. He crossed the floor in a matter of seconds, his long strides eating up the distance between them. Nicole turned around just as he reached the window, and before she could say a single word, Francis reached out and pulled her into his arms. He held her tightly, his face buried in her hair, his chest heaving with a massive, shuddering sob of pure relief. Nicole wrapped her arms around his waist, burying her face in his wool coat, letting the last remnants of the past month's misery melt away in his warmth. "I'm sorry," Francis whispered into her hair, his voice trembling. "I am so sorry I let her hurt you." "You didn't know," Nicole said softly, pulling back just enough to look into his eyes. They were clear now, free of the hollow despair that had haunted them for weeks. "I should have trusted you. I should have shown you the letter." "It doesn't matter now," Francis said, his hands framing her face, his thumb gently wiping away a stray tear. "It's over. The administration has the file. She's being removed from the department. You are safe." "Francis, Nicole," a sharp, authoritative voice shattered the silence of the room. They pulled apart quickly to find Professor Elena Vance standing near the conductor's podium, her arms crossed over her chest, a stern, unreadable expression on her face. Behind her, several other choir members were beginning to trickle into the room, their eyes wide as they witnessed the scene. Francis didn't hesitate. He took Nicole's hand, locking his fingers firmly through hers, and walked directly down to the front of the stage to face the conductor. "Professor Vance," Francis said, his voice ringing out with an absolute, unshakable strength that surprised everyone in the room. "Before you say anything, I need to make this clear. I love Nicole. If our presence together violates the handbook, you have the option to remove me and Nicole from the choir program immediately. I will not compromise on this. There is nothing anyone can do to change it." A collective gasp rippled through the few choir members who had gathered near the entrance. The silence that followed was suffocating as Professor Vance stared at them over the rim of her reading glasses, her gaze fixed on their joined hands. For 10 long seconds, the future of their scholarships hung in the balance. Then, the corners of Professor Vance's mouth twitched, and she let out a long, weary sigh, tossing her baton onto her music stand. "Oh, for heaven's sake, Francis," Vance said, her voice softening into a tone that was more maternal than academic. "Do you think I am entirely blind? I have running water in my veins, not ice." She stepped forward, looking at the two of them with a gentle shake of her head. The non-fraternization rule was put into the handbook 20 years ago because we wanted the choir to focus on singing, not drama. It was meant to protect the artistic integrity of the program. It was never intended to be an ironclad cage to crush genuine devotion. I have seen what the past month of silence did to both of your voices, and frankly, it was destroying my soprano section. Everyone in the room held their breath. You must remain completely professional during official university hours and performances, Vance continued, a firm but kind smile finally breaking through her strict demeanor. But I understand young love when I see it. And quite frankly, Francis, if I lost my best accompanist and my most improved soprano on the same day, I would have to conduct the mid-year showcase with a group of tenors who still can't find A-flat. And I simply don't have the patience for that. A sudden, joyous cheer erupted from the doorway as the rest of the choir members poured into the room, clapping and whistling. Francis looked at Nicole, a massive, radiant smile breaking across his face, and he lifted her hand to press a soft, triumphant kiss against her knuckles. All right, that is enough theater for one morning," Professor Vance called out, tapping her pen against the music stand to restore order, though her eyes were twinkling with warmth. "To your risers, everyone. Open your folders to the third movement. We have a showcase to prepare for, and today, I want to hear some real harmony." With happy, light hearts, the choir members scrambled up the steps of the risers. Nicole walked over to the western window one last time, patted the warm wood of her guitar, and left it sitting proudly in the sun, a permanent monument to a code that had finally brought them home. The anatomy of a shared bench, the applause from the sanctuary choir slowly died away into the high rafters of the rehearsal hall, replaced by the crisp, orderly rustle of turning pages. Though the air in the room felt lighter than it had in months, the weight of Professor Vance's warning hung tangibly over the front stage. Professional boundaries. It was an easy phrase to utter, but a difficult geometry to maintain when two people had spent weeks starved of each other's presence. Francis returned to the Steinway grand piano, his long fingers resting on the keys. His posture was straight, his eyes fixed on the open vocal score before him, but his chest rose and fell with a deep, steady calm that had been absent for a month. Across the room, Nicole stood on the second tier of the soprano risers. She didn't have her guitar to shield her chest anymore, but she didn't need it. Her chin was lifted, her shoulders relaxed. When Professor Vance brought her baton down for the first downbeat of the Bach movement, Nicole's voice emerged like water breaking through an old stone dam. It was round, fully supported, and perfectly blended with the alto line beneath her, yet it possessed a distinct, radiant clarity that made the other sopranos instinctively adjust their own pitch to match hers. "Better, Miss Reyes," Professor Vance noted without stopping her baton, her sharp eyes darting over the rim of her glasses. "Much better. The placement is no longer trapped in your throat. Tenors, take note of that breath entry, do not drag." When the 2-hour block finally concluded, the students began packing their leather folders with a renewed, gossipy energy. Whispers followed Francis and Nicole as they moved through the room, but neither of them paid the glances any mind. "Francis," Vance called out as she wiped her baton with a velvet cloth. "A word regarding the showcase program." Francis waited by the podium until the last student had trickled through the heavy oak doors. Nicole lingered near the back, unzipping her canvas guitar case by the western window. "The Board of Trustees will be sitting in the center balcony for the mid-year performance on Friday," Vance said quietly, her voice dropping its usual academic sharpness. "Clara's father has pulled his funding from the new arts wing following her sudden administrative withdrawal this morning. The atmosphere among the directors is tense, Francis. They are looking for a reason to find fault with our department. The music will be flawless, Professor," Francis replied, his voice unswerving. "I will ensure the accompaniment leaves no room for criticism." "I am not worried about your fingers, Francis. I am worried about your eyes," Vance said, looking past him to where Nicole stood by the windowsill. "The university handbook is a weapon in the hands of people who feel compromised. Keep your distance on stage. Let the music be the only bridge between you until the final notes fade. Am I understood?" "Yes, Professor." Once Vance departed, locking the side office behind her, the silence of the vast hall rushed back in. Francis turned and walked toward the western window. The late morning sun was hitting the glass at an angle, throwing long, golden rectangles across the polished floorboards. Nicole was already waiting for him, her guitar slung over her shoulder. She didn't say anything as he approached. She simply reached out and caught the hem of his woolen sleeve, her fingers tightening against the fabric. "It feels strange," she whispered, looking up at him, "to have everything out in the open, yet we still have to pretend when the doors open." "We aren't pretending anymore," Francis said gently, lifting his hand to place it over hers, his thumb tracing the rough, calloused tips of her fingers. "Before, the silence was a wall. Now it's just a boundary. We know what's on the other side of it." "They're talking about Clara's father," she said, her eyes darkening with a trace of the old anxiety. "The scholarship is secure," Francis interrupted firmly. "The administration has the original letters she intercepted. The legal injunction stands. Her family can pull their donations, but they cannot rewrite the university's academic charter. You earned your place here with your voice, Nicole, not their money." He led her over to the piano bench, sitting down on the long, dark wood and gesturing for her to sit beside him. It was the same bench where he had spent hours correcting her posture, but the distance between them now was gone. "Show me what you played last night," Francis said, his voice dropping into a low, warm register. "In the basement. I heard the chorus through the floorboards, but I want to see how your fingers find the chords." Nicole smiled, the last remnants of the morning's tension melting from her face. She settled the guitar on her knee, her right hand finding the strings. But she didn't play the aggressive, driving rhythm of her solo sets. She played a soft, arpeggiated variant of guitar by the windowsill, her strings ringing out in tandem with the soft, low-register chords Francis began to trace on the piano keys beside her. For the first time, the classical ivory of the Steinway and the raw steel of the acoustic guitar weren't fighting for dominance. They were building a third language, one measure at a time. The high stakes of the mid-year showcase. By Friday evening, the university's great hall was transformed into a sea of black velvet, polished brass, and the low, collective murmur of 500 attendees. The air was heavy with the scent of damp wool from the winter coats checked at the door and the sharp, chemical sting of the stage hairsprays used by the vocal departments. In the backstage wing, the sanctuary choir stood in a double line, their formal black robes flowing around them like uniform shadows. The energy was electric, vibrating with the unique terror that only a live, acoustic performance before an institutional board could produce. Nicole stood in the middle of the soprano line, her hands tucked into the wide sleeves of her robe to keep her fingers from shaking. Without her guitar, she felt the familiar chill of vulnerability creeping back into her limbs. She looked through the gap in the velvet backstage curtain, her eyes searching the dim orchestra pit. Francis was already there. He sat at the massive concert grand piano, his white cuffs gleaming against his black tuxedo. He looked completely detached from the chaos around him, his eyes fixed on the blank sheet music before him, his fingers resting motionless on his knees. "2 minutes, ladies and gentlemen," the stage manager whispered, his clipboard tapping against his palm. "Remember the spacing on the risers, no shuffling." Professor Vance stepped past the line of singers, her face a pale, determined mask beneath the harsh backstage lights. She paused beside Nicole, her hand coming to rest briefly on the girl's shoulder. "The third movement, Miss Reyes," Vance said, her voice dropping so low the surrounding sopranos couldn't catch the words. "Give them the voice you found in the dark. Don't give them the conservatory. Give them the truth." The house lights dimmed to a deep, solemn blue. The heavy velvet curtains split apart with a slow, mechanical groan, revealing the vast, cavernous expanse of the auditorium. The audience was nothing more than a massive, dark entity, their faces obscured by the brilliant white glare of the footlights. The choir marched out in perfect, rhythmic synchronization, their black robes rustling like dry leaves as they took their positions on the high wooden risers. Nicole kept her eyes up, staring directly at the center exit sign at the back of the hall, avoiding the front row where the university trustees sat in their high-backed leather chairs. Francis shifted on his bench. He raised his hands to the keys, and the first chord of the introduction shattered the silence of the hall. It wasn't a soft entry. It was a massive, ringing pillar of sound that vibrated through the floorboards of the stage. Francis played with a sudden, unleashed power that caught even Professor Vance off guard. The tempo was precise, but the delivery carried the distinct, driving energy of someone who had spent his weekend playing an organ in a smoky basement. He was anchoring the entire room, turning the grand piano into a shield for the choir behind him. The first two movements passed in a blur of complex, multi-part harmonies. The choir performed with flawless discipline, their voices blending into a single, massive instrument that filled the vaulted ceiling. Then came the transition to the third movement, the solo section that had previously been Nicole's greatest struggle. The rest of the choir dropped their folders to their sides, taking a synchronous step backward on the risers. Nicole remained at the front edge of the second tier, completely isolated in the center light. Francis modified his touch on the keys. The grand piano's volume dropped to a delicate, shimmering murmur, a rolling fingerstyle pattern translated onto ivory. It was the exact cadence of her guitar intro from the gilded chord, disguised within the classical structure of the Bach piece. He was giving her code. Nicole took a deep breath, her chest expanding fully. She didn't look at the audience, and she didn't look at the trustees. She looked down at the orchestra pit, catching the exact reflection of the stage lights in Francis's dark eyes. She opened her mouth, and her voice flew. It was unlike any soprano solo the university had heard that semester. It possessed the rounded, flawless resonance that the conservatory demanded, but beneath the technical perfection lay the raw, storytelling grit of the gilded chord. She didn't sing to the front row. She sang to the far back corners of the balcony, her voice carrying a deep, heartbreaking warmth that made the sterile air of the great hall feel suddenly small and intimate. In the balcony, two of the older trustees leaned forward, their programs forgotten in their laps. Professor Vance's baton hand slowed slightly, her face softening into an expression of profound, quiet triumph. Nicole held the final, high note of the movement with an absolute, unswerving stability, letting the vibrato bloom naturally at the very end until it was swallowed by the soft, decaying chord Francis struck on the piano. When the final movement concluded and the curtains pulled shut, the silence in the hall lasted for one full, agonizing second. Then the auditorium erupted. It wasn't the polite, academic applause typical of a mid-year review. It was a roar. The sound of hundreds of hands clapping rhythmically slammed against the wooden stage doors. Behind the curtain, the choir members broke formation, laughing and hugging one another. Nicole stood still on the risers, her chest heaving as the adrenaline drained from her body. Through the crowd of black robes, Francis appeared. He didn't care about the stage managers or the remaining faculty members watching from the wings. He stepped onto the risers, stopped a single foot away from her, respecting the boundary of the stage, yet closing the distance entirely with his presence, and looked at her with a smile that broke through his usual quiet reserve. "You didn't need the parachute," he said, his voice carrying clearly over the noise of the crowd. Nicole looked back at him, her eyes bright with tears she no longer had to hide. "I had the piano." The Saturday ledger, the triumph of the mid-year showcase, did not instantly alter the physical reality of their lives. It simply changed the way they carried themselves through it. By Saturday morning, the great hall was locked and dark again, but the university campus felt entirely different to Nicole as she walked toward the West Wing. The weekend morning was crisp, the air carrying the sharp, clean scent of recent rain and cut grass. In her right hand, her canvas guitar case swung with a light, familiar rhythm. She no longer felt like she was smuggling a contraband weapon into an enemy camp. The instrument belonged here, just as she did. When she pushed open the doors to the rehearsal hall, she found Francis already there, though he wasn't at the Steinway. He was sitting on the low wooden bench beneath the western arched window, a small leather ledger open on his knees, a standard blue ballpoint pen balanced between his fingers. "Professor Vance left her keys with the gatekeeper," Francis said, looking up as the door clicked shut behind her. A warm, unhurried smile touched his lips. "She said we could have 2 hours before the afternoon sectional blocks begin." Nicole walked over, setting her case flat on the wide sill. Instead of opening it immediately, she sat down on the bench beside him, their shoulders brushing. "What are you writing?" "A ledger," Francis said, turning the book so she could see the neat, slanted lines of his handwriting. "But not for choral scores. I'm mapping out the weekend schedules for the gilded chord and the acoustic circuit in the neighboring districts." Nicole blinked in surprise. "The acoustic circuit? You didn't think we were going to stop playing the basements, did you?" Francis asked, his eyes crinkling at the corners. The trustees were impressed last night, deeply so, but the voice you found down there, Nicole, that isn't something we can let turn into a museum piece for the university board. You built a floor under your feet when you thought you were falling. We should keep building it." He pointed to the ledger entries. He had meticulously calculated the travel times between the campus and 3 different folk venues, balancing her weekday scholarship requirements with the weekend open mics. "Julian told me that honesty is expensive down here," Nicole said softly, her fingers tracing the edge of the leather book. "He said the choir kids usually run back to their sheet music because nobody applauds their breath control." "Julian hasn't heard you play when you aren't afraid of the room," Francis replied. He closed the ledger and reached for her guitar case, flicking the metallic latches open himself. He lifted the mahogany instrument into the morning light and placed it gently into her lap. "Play the song, the real version. No Bach, no classical placement. Just the one you wrote when the windowsill was empty." Nicole settled her fingers onto the fretboard. She looked at the wide expanse of the empty hall, then back to Francis. The room was vast and silent, but it no longer felt cold. She struck a low, open E minor chord, letting the raw steel strings vibrate against the cedar top. As she began the rhythmic finger-picking pattern of Guitar by the Windowsill, Francis didn't move toward the piano. He stayed right beside her on the bench, his hand resting on the dark wood between them, keeping time by the quiet, steady tapping of his index finger against the ledger. The second language, by April, the collaboration between the conservatory's assistant conductor and its most unconventional soprano had become a permanent fixture of the local music scene. They had established a rhythm that Professor Vance tolerated with a kind of amused, professional detachment. As long as the Latin hymns remained flawless on Mondays, she turned a blind eye to the flyers for the gilded cord pinned to the student union board on Fridays. It was a Friday evening when the true evolution of their music took shape. The basement coffee house was crowded, the air thick with the usual haze of clove smoke and espresso steam, but the atmosphere had shifted from curiosity to expectation. Nicole was no longer the unknown girl from the provinces. She was a headliner for the weekend acoustic sets. She took the stage alone for her first 3 songs, her voice cutting through the chatter with that same honest, unrounded grit she had mastered in the dark. The crowd snapped their fingers, their mugs clinking against the wooden tables in rhythm. Then, during the intermission before her final piece, Nicole adjusted the microphone stand and looked toward the back exit. "For this last song," she said into the microphone, her voice steady and warm, "I'd like to bring up someone who used to tell me how to sing, but now helps me figure out what to say." A low murmur of appreciation rippled through the audience as Francis stepped out of the shadows. He didn't look flustered or out of place in his simple woolen sweater and rolled-up sleeves. He moved toward the electric reed organ in the corner of the stage, flipping the blower switch. The familiar mechanical hum filled the background, a low, grounding bass line. They didn't play his response song, and they didn't play her original version. They played a new arrangement they had built on the shared piano bench during the quiet Saturday mornings. Nicole started the rhythm on her guitar, her fingers moving with a swift, instinctive confidence. A second later, Francis's hands found the organ keys, throwing a rich, warm layer of major chords beneath her steel strings. The heavy, church-like resonance of the organ gave her acoustic melody a massive, architectural space to expand into. When she sang the chorus, she didn't sing about a broken trust or a stranger's letter anymore. She had rewritten the verses to reflect the reality of the room they had built together. Verse 3, "The glass is clear and the shadows have fled. We are singing the words that we should have said. No secret codes in the hollow of the wood, just a simple truth that we both understood. The window is open, the winter is gone, and the chords that we strike are moving us on." Francis joined her on the harmony during the final refrain, his deep, resonant baritone locking perfectly into her angelic upper register. It wasn't the uniform, blended harmony of the sanctuary choir. It was a conversation between 2 distinct identities, neither one swallowing the other. The basement was entirely still, the patrons frozen with their cups halfway to their mouths, completely captivated by the raw, unpolished beauty of the duet. The music didn't sound like the conservatory, and it didn't sound like standard folk rock. It was something entirely their own, a third language born from a wooden box and an open window. When the last note decayed into the hum of the amplifier, The applause that followed was a violent, joyful release of energy that shook the small basement. Nicole looked over at Francis, her face radiant under the low stage light. And he smiled back, a quiet, knowing look that told her everything she needed to know. The guitar by the windowsill was no longer just a code for safety. It was their compass. The midterm assessment, by the middle of April, the high-stakes pressure of the university's formal academic calendar collided with the late-night momentum of the acoustic music scene. The halls of the conservatory were no longer gold-rimmed with morning light. They were gray with the exhaustion of midterm examinations. Students drifted through the corridors like pale insomniacs, clutching sheets of sight-reading exercises and nursing flasks of lukewarm black coffee. For Nicole, the dual life was beginning to leave a physical toll. Her fingers bore the permanent, deep indentations of steel strings, while her throat felt dry from alternating between the pristine, operatic breath control required by Professor Vance and the smoky vocal projection she needed for the gilded cord. On a Wednesday morning, she stood outside the evaluation room, her folder pressed flat against her chest. The midterm vocal assessment was a closed-door trial, just the student, a single piano accompanist, and 3 faculty judges. Miss Reyes, the department secretary, called out, checking a name off a master ledger. "You're up next. Room 204. Nicole took a deep breath, her pulse quickening as she pushed the heavy oak door open. The room was small, designed for maximum acoustic isolation. The walls were lined with heavy acoustic tiles that swallowed every stray vibration, making the silence inside feel heavy and unnatural. Sitting at the small upright piano in the corner wasn't Francis. To ensure complete academic neutrality, the department had assigned a senior instructor, Mr. Harrison, to accompany the soprano students. Francis sat at the center evaluation table, sandwiched between Professor Vance and the head of the vocal department, Dr. Harris. He looked strictly professional in his gray wool vest, his eyes neutral, though he gave her a small, imperceptible nod as she stepped onto the small performance square marked on the floor. "Whenever you are ready, Miss Reyes," Professor Vance said, her glasses resting on the tip of her nose. The Italian art song. Focus on the vowels in the second movement. The board is looking for purity of tone. Mr. Harrison struck the introductory chord. The tone of the upright piano was sharp, lacking the deep, resonant warmth of the grand Steinway in the main hall. Without her guitar, and without Francis's hands guiding the tempo, Nicole felt a sudden, cold flash of the old vulnerability. The dry air of the small room caught in her throat. She began the first phrase. Her pitch was accurate, but her voice felt restricted, tight within the small geometric confines of the room. She could see Dr. Harris make a swift, small note on his ledger sheet. From the center of the table, Francis shifted his posture. He didn't speak. To do so would break the evaluation protocol, but he deliberately closed his evaluation binder, leaning forward and resting his chin on his locked fingers. He looked directly into her eyes, his gaze steady, unblinking, and filled with the exact same quiet certainty he had shown her during their very first session after hours. "Look at my eyes," his silence seemed to say. "Don't look at the tiles, don't look at the ledger." Nicole caught his gaze. She anchored herself to the dark intensity of his eyes, just as she had done on the shared piano bench. Her shoulders dropped. She stopped trying to force the operatic volume into the sterile room. Instead, she took a deep, supported breath from her diaphragm and opened her throat, letting the natural, radiant warmth of her storytelling voice infuse the strict Italian vowels. The melody transformed instantly. The song was no longer a rigid academic exercise. It became a narrative, carrying the grit and emotional weight of a person who had fought her way out of the shadows. When the final note faded into the acoustic tile lining, Dr. Harris paused, his pen hovering over the paper. He looked up, a surprised expression crossing his features. "An unusual interpretation, Miss Reyes," Dr. Harris remarked, tapping his pen against the desk. "It lacks the standard operatic volume we typically look for in this particular movement, but the resonance, the emotional clarity is undeniable. It carries a remarkably honest quality." "It is called artistry, Dr. Harris," Professor Vance said softly, a small, triumphant smile playing at the corners of her mouth as she marked a high grade on her sheet. "Thank you, Miss Reyes, you are dismissed." Nicole bowed slightly, her heart finally slowing down to a normal rhythm. As she turned to leave the room, she caught Francis's reflection in the glass of the small door window. He was reopening his binder, his face perfectly neutral once more. But his fingers were lightly tracing a rhythm against the wood of the table, the exact tempo of guitar by the windowsill. The echo in the corridor, the grey exhaustion of the exam week, finally broke on Saturday afternoon, replaced by a rare, warm breeze that carried the scent of the sea from the city's harbour district. The conservatory was completely deserted, the students having fled the campus the moment the final evaluation bells rang at noon. Nicole walked through the empty West Wing, her boots clicking softly against the marble tiles. She carried her guitar in its case, her intention simply to leave it by the western window as a silent marker before heading down to the old district for her weekend sound check. As she turned the corner toward the main rehearsal hall, she stopped. A sound was echoing through the long corridor, not the structured, mathematical geometry of classical piano music, and not the heavy resonance of the electric reed organ. It was a single, acoustic melody played with a light, contemplative touch on a nylon-stringed classical guitar. The music was coming from room 108, the small, sun-drenched practice space usually reserved for the string department. Nicole approached the door quietly, looking through the narrow vertical pane of glass. Francis was sitting on a low stool by the radiator, an old, amber-stained classical guitar resting across his knee. He wasn't playing with the aggressive, rhythmic drive she used for her folk sets. His fingers were moving across the frets with a classical precision, tracing a complex, beautiful counter-melody that wrapped around the familiar intervals of her own songs. She pushed the door open slowly, the hinges giving a soft, musical creak. Francis didn't stop playing. He looked up, his eyes warm as he tracked her movement across the small room. He transitioned smoothly into a simpler chord structure, leaving an open space in the arrangement. "I didn't know you played the guitar," Nicole said, sitting down on the edge of a vacant music stand bass, her case resting against her shin. "My father bought it for me when I was 12, Francis said, his fingers continuing to pluck a gentle arpeggio. "Before the university told me that the piano was the only instrument worthy of a classical conductor. I used to sit on the back porch and try to match the rhythm of the crickets in the evening." "Why did you stop?" "Because the piano is easy to control," Francis said, stopping his hand and letting the nylon strings hum into silence. He looked down at the amber wood of the instrument. "An orchestra, a grand piano, a choir, they are systems, they follow laws. If you strike the key with a specific velocity, you get the exact same frequency every single time. But the guitar, it changes with the weather. It changes with the pressure of your skin. It's too human." He stood up, walking over to her and holding the instrument out by its neck. "Try the counter melody with me. Use your steel strings for the rhythm, and I'll use the nylon for the top line." Nicole unzipped her case, lifting her mahogany guitar into the afternoon light. They sat side by side on two small wooden stools, the necks of their instruments crossing like a silent agreement. When they began to play, the contrast between the two instruments was beautiful. Nicole's steel strings provided a sharp, crisp anchor, a steady heartbeat that filled the small practice room. Francis's nylon strings danced above her chords, his classical training giving the folk melody a sophisticated, haunting depth that made the simple progression sound like an ancient hymn. They didn't sing. They let the wood and the wire do the talking, their hands moving in perfect, intuitive synchronization. In the small, isolated room, far removed from the judgment of the trustees and the roar of the basement crowds, they were establishing a new sanctuary, one that didn't require a handbook, a scholarship, or a boundary to exist. The tape machine and the high table. By the first week of May, the air in the city had turned thick and humid, carrying the scent of blooming jasmine and the heavy exhaust of the afternoon buses. The conservatory was entering its final, chaotic stretch before graduation. But for Francis and Nicole, the real work was happening after midnight in a tiny, makeshift recording studio above a local radio repair shop down by the docks. The room belonged to a friend of Julian's named Marcus, a man who spoke in grunts and smelled of solder and stale coffee. The studio consisted of a single, sound-insulated room lined with egg cartons and a massive two-track reel-to-reel tape machine that hissed like a snake whenever the iron reels began to spin. "The tape doesn't lie, kid," Marcus said, adjusting a heavy Bakelite dial on the console while a cigarette dangled from the corner of his mouth. If your timing is off by a millisecond, the machine will catch it, and you can't fix it with a baton. Nicole sat on a high stool in the center of the room, her mahogany guitar balanced on her knee. The microphone before her was a heavy, silver ribbon model from the previous decade, sensitive enough to catch the rustle of her sleeve against the wood of the instrument. Francis stood behind the glass partition, his fingers resting on the console beside Marcus. He wasn't conducting tonight, he was listening. Every breath she took, every subtle scratch of her fingernail against the steel strings was being etched into the dark magnetic tape. "Let's try Guitar by the Windowsill one more time." Francis's voice came through the small talkback speaker, crisp and clear. But Nicole, on the transition to the bridge, "Don't rush the tempo to match your pulse. Trust the space between the notes. Let the tape breathe." Nicole nodded, wiping a bead of sweat from her forehead. She struck the first chord, the rich, familiar rhythm filling her headphones. This demo tape was their bid for independence. If they could finish a solid 4-song recording before the end of the term. Julian had promised to pass the reel to a regional independent distributor who specialized in the growing acoustic folk movement. It was a tangible escape route from the university's institutional boundaries, a way to ensure that when graduation arrived, they wouldn't have to beg the traditional classical boards for a placement. As the reels turned, Francis watched her through the glass. He could see the intense, grueling focus in her eyes, the same discipline that had once made her fingers bleed on the frets during her solitary practice sessions. She was no longer just surviving the music, she was mastering it. When the song concluded and the tape came to a smooth, mechanical stop, Marcus let out a low whistle, flicking his cigarette ash into a tin can. "That's the one, purity and grit, all in one take. You're ready for the lacquer cut." But the triumph of the dark studio was abruptly challenged the following afternoon. Francis was summoned to the high table, the grand, oak-paneled boardroom where the university directors and the major financial trustees held their monthly administrative reviews. The room smelled of old leather, expensive tobacco, and the cold weight of institutional power. Sitting at the center of the table was Dr. Aris, alongside 2 representatives from the university's financial board. Professor Vance sat at the far end, her posture rigid, her expression guarded. "Francis," Dr. Aris began, sliding a glossy promotional flyer across the polished wood. It was an advertisement for the Gilded Chord, featuring Nicole's name and a small mention of a special classical duet accompaniment. "We have been made aware of your weekend activities in the lower district," Aris continued, his voice carrying the smooth, dangerous diplomacy of a man protecting an endowment. "The showcase performance was a technical success, yes, but the board is concerned about branding. The University Sanctuary Choir is a classical institution backed by centuries of tradition. Our student leaders are expected to pursue fellowships with the regional symphonies, not basement coffee houses." Francis didn't look at the flyer. He kept his hands clasped behind his back, his chin lifted. "The music we are playing down there is reaching an audience that would never step foot inside the Great Hall, Dr. Aris. It is an expansion of our musical identity, not a contradiction." "It is a distraction," one of the trustees countered sharply, tapping a manicured finger against the table. "The Vance Montgomery family has officially frozen their contribution to the new pipe organ fund. They feel the department has handled the recent administrative issues with an unacceptable lack of discretion. If the university's leading accompanist is seen moonlighting in folk clubs with a scholarship student, it damages our prestige." Professor Vance cleared her throat, her voice cutting through the tension with an authoritative weight. "Francis's technical duties have been executed flawlessly, gentlemen. The choir's midterm marks are the highest they have been in 5 years. Be that as it may, Elena," Dr. Aris said smoothly, turning his eyes back to Francis. "The line has been drawn. A formal fellowship with the Capitol Philharmonic has opened for next term. It includes a full stipend and a guaranteed path to a master's conductor program. But it requires an absolute commitment. No outside performances, no folk collaborations. You must choose, Francis. Are you a conductor of the classical tradition, or are you a musician of the streets?" The choice at the crossroad. The weight of the high table's ultimatum followed Francis back to the West Wing like a physical shadow. The choice was not merely a professional one. It was an architecture designed to dismantle the very language he and Nicole had built together. The fellowship with the Capitol Philharmonic was the pinnacle of everything he had trained for since he was 12 years old. The prestige, the stability, the ultimate validation of his quiet, disciplined life at the Ivory Keys. But as he stood in the empty rehearsal hall, staring at the grand Steinway piano, the keys looked cold. They looked like a system that had already been solved. The side door creaked open, and Nicole walked in, carrying a small brown paper package. It was the first acetate test pressing of their demo tape from the docks, fresh from Marcus's cutting lathe. Her face was bright with an uncharacteristic, bubbling excitement. "Marcus finished the master cut," she said, holding the package out like a trophy. "He said the dynamics on the second track are perfect. We can send the reels to the distributor by Monday." She stopped when she saw his expression. The brightness faded from her eyes, replaced by a sudden, intuitive stillness. "What happened, Francis?" Francis walked over to the western window, his hand resting on the wide wooden sill where her guitar usually sat. "The board offered me the Capitol Fellowship." Nicole's breath hitched. She knew what that word meant. In their world, the Capitol Fellowship was a mythic destination, the kind of opportunity that only knocked once in a lifetime for a musician from the provinces. That's everything you've been working for, Francis. The symphony, the master's track. "It comes with a condition," he said quietly, turning to face her. "No outside performances, no folk collaborations. They want me to clean up my ledger, Nicole. They want me to leave the basements behind." The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the distant chime of the campus clock tower striking 4. Nicole looked down at the acetate package in her hands. The cardboard suddenly felt fragile, a small, insignificant thing compared to the massive institutional machinery of the Capitol Philharmonic. She understood the trap perfectly. If he accepted, she would be left alone in the clubs, her scholarship secure but her anchor gone. If he refused, he would be throwing away his entire career before it had even truly begun, all for the sake of an unproven acoustic duet in a smoke-filled basement. "You have to take it," she whispered, her voice cracking slightly as she forced the words out. "Francis, you're a musician by profession. The teachers, the conductor, everyone knows you belong on that podium. You can't throw away a symphony for a coffeehouse song." Francis stepped away from the window. He walked over to her, his movements unhurried, and took the brown paper package from her hands, setting it gently on top of the closed piano lid. Then he reached down and took both her hands in his fingers curling around her calloused fingertips. "When I first saw you at the audition," Francis said, his voice dropping into that rich, unswerving baritone that always steadied her pulse, "I knew you were the one, not just for me but for the music. I spent years playing other people's scores, Nicole, following the velocity, matching the intervals, playing the system. But when you sing, the room changes. When we play together, we aren't just following a law, we are making one." He looked toward the high rafters of the hall. "The Capitol Fellowship is a beautiful cage, but it's still a cage. If I sit on that podium and look out at 100 musicians playing a perfect historical score, I'll still be listening for the sound of steel strings against a cedar top." "Francis, we send the reels to the distributor on Monday," he said, a small, definitive smile breaking through his serious features. "And tonight, we play the Gilded Chord. We have a sound check at 8, and I don't intend to keep the dockworkers waiting." Nicole looked into his eyes, seeing the absolute, unshakable certainty that had defined him from the very beginning. The fear that had haunted her since the violet-ink letter completely evaporated, replaced by a deep, revolutionary fire. They weren't just surviving the crossroad, they were choosing their own direction, and for the first time in her life, the path ahead felt entirely clear. The open air and the freight train, by the third week of May. The damp brick walls of the Gilded Chord could no longer contain the momentum. The acetate test, pressing that Marcus had cut in the dark of the docks, had found its way into the hands of a regional promoter named Thomas Crane, a man who organized the annual Blackwood Valley Folk Festival. Blackwood was not a sanctuary for classical discipline. It was an open-air gathering held in a sweeping, grassy basin 30 miles outside the city, where the stage was a massive wooden flatbed truck parked near a dead freight rail line. The audience didn't sit in velvet-lined gallery chairs. They sat on mismatched quilts, upturned apple crates, and the hoods of faded station wagons. For Nicole, the transition from the sterile acoustic isolation of the university to the vast, uncontained space of the valley was terrifying. "The sound doesn't bounce back, Francis," she whispered, her fingers trembling as she tightened the tuning pegs of her guitar behind the flatbed truck. The afternoon sun was hot, beating down on her denim skirt and casting the long shadow of the stage microphone across her boots. "When I strum, the wind just takes the notes and carries them over the ridge. I can't hear my own pitch." Francis stood beside her, his linen shirt unbuttoned at the collar, a far cry from the stiff tuxedos of the conservatory. He was holding his old amber-stained nylon guitar, his fingers testing the tension of the strings. "The wind isn't your enemy, Nicole," Francis said, his voice dropping into that grounding, rhythmic baritone that had guided her through every trial. "In the hall, you were singing to the walls. Here, you're singing to the horizon. Don't try to pull the sound back. Push it all the way to the tree line." When the master of ceremonies shouted their names through a dented metal megaphone, a crowd of nearly 800 people turned their faces toward the flatbed. These weren't the quiet, predictable patrons of the coffee house or the elite trustees of the high table. These were farmers, millworkers, and traveling students, a sea of sunburned shoulders, flannel shirts, and wide-brimmed straw hats. Nicole stepped onto the wooden planks, the sun blinding her for a brief second. She slung her mahogany guitar into position and looked at Francis. He didn't have a grand piano or a mechanical reed organ. He had a simple wooden stool and a nylon-stringed classical instrument. He gave her a single, definitive nod. Nicole struck her first chord, a massive, ringing G major that cut through the open air. The sound didn't hit a plaster wall and return to her. It traveled outward, vibrating across the tall grass of the valley. They began with "The Water is Wide," the old folk hymn that had almost cost her the university audition. But they didn't play it the way Professor Vance had demanded. Francis's nylon strings provided an intricate, classical counter-melody that danced like sunlight on water, while Nicole's steel strings hammered out a steady, driving rhythm that felt like a heartbeat. By the second verse, her voice found its footing. It rose above the flatbed, carrying a clear, crystalline power that seemed to silence the very wind. The crowd on the hillside stopped moving. People who had been lining up for cider turned around, their attention locked onto the small stage. Then, just as they transitioned into the bridge of guitar by the windowsill, a heavy, metallic roar echoed from the north. A commercial freight train was passing along the old rail line just 100 yards behind the festival grounds. The steel wheels shrieked against the tracks, and the massive diesel engine thundered through the valley, a wall of industrial noise that threatened to swallow their acoustic performance whole. The crowd shifted uncomfortably, a few people sighing at the distraction. But Francis didn't stop. His fingers moved across his nylon strings with a sudden, aggressive velocity, shifting the counter-melody into a dark, rhythmic minor key that mimicked the heavy clack-clack of the train wheels. He looked at Nicole, his eyes burning with an intense, unyielding fire. "Don't back down," his hands were saying. "Use the room." Nicole didn't flinch. She took a massive breath, her diaphragm expanding against her canvas belt, and she leaned directly into the silver microphone. She didn't try to sing over the train, she sang with it. She unleashed the full, raw power of the voice she had discovered in the smoky basements, a bluesy, defiant belt that locked into the rhythm of the thundering engine. Verse 4, "Let the iron wheels roll through the valley floor. They can't silence the song that we are fighting for. Every mountain can shake, every shadow can cry, but the wire and the wood are gonna reach the sky." The combination was devastating. The raw steel of her guitar, the intricate classical beauty of Francis's counterpoint, and the rhythmic roar of the passing train blended into a massive, accidental symphony that shook the very ground beneath the audience's feet. When the last train car finally rattled past, and the song hit its final, ringing crescendo, the valley was silent for a fraction of a second. Then, the entire hillside erupted into a wild, roaring standing ovation. People threw their hats into the air, stamping their boots against the earth, until the dust rose around them like gold in the late afternoon sun. The sovereign note, the sun was dipping below the purple ridge of the Blackwood Valley when Francis and Nicole finally made their way back to the promoter's tent behind the stage. The air was cooling rapidly, carrying the sharp scent of wood smoke from the campfires being lit across the festival grounds. Thomas Crane was waiting for them, a thick ledger open on his small folding table, his face split into a wide, gap-toothed grin. "I've been running this festival for 9 years," Crane said, slamming a heavy hand down on the ledger. "I've seen rock bands with 3 trucks of amplifiers make less noise than the 2 of you did with 26 strings and a microphone." The distributor from the Capitol, the one Julian sent the tape to, he was standing by the soundboard. "He wants the first 1,000 pressings of the single by June." He slid a small white envelope across the table. Inside was their performance fee, a sum of cash that exceeded Nicole's entire remaining tuition balance for the year. Nicole looked at the money, then up at Francis. The independent floor they had been building had finally turned into a foundation. They were no longer running from the university handbook or hiding from the threat of a frozen scholarship. They were free. "Thank you, Mr. Crane," Francis said, his voice maintaining that calm, professional dignity that had once defined him in the high boardrooms, though his eyes were bright with a triumphant satisfaction. By midnight, they were back in the city, but they didn't return to their separate boarding houses. Instead, they walked up the creaking wooden stairs to Francis's small attic apartment, which sat just beneath the roofline of an old brick building overlooking the darkened university campus. The room was modest, smelling of aged sheet music, cedarwood, and the rain that had begun to mist against the glass. At the far end of the room sat a wide, deep-set dormer window. Its wooden sill was worn smooth from years of weathering, wide enough to act as a bench of its own. Nicole walked across the floorboards, her limbs heavy with the beautiful exhaustion of the festival. She unzipped her canvas case one last time that night, lifting her battered mahogany guitar. She didn't place it back in the dark of its velvet lining. Instead, she walked to the dormer window, pushed the glass open a few inches to let the cool, midnight breeze drift in, and laid the instrument flat across the wide wooden sill. The silver moonlight cut through the glass, bathing the cedar top in a pale, ethereal glow. The dark circle of the sound hole faced upward, no longer a hiding place for frantic, anxious secrets, but an open chamber catching the steady, peaceful rhythm of the night. Francis walked over, standing behind her, his hands coming to rest gently on her shoulders. He looked down at the instrument resting securely on the wood, the city lights reflecting softly off its lacquer. "There it is," Francis whispered, leaning his chin against her hair. "The true alignment." "It looks different here," Nicole said softly, leaning back against his chest. "At the conservatory, whenever I put it by the window, my heart would race. I was always waiting for the other shoe to drop, always terrified someone would see it and take everything away." "No one can take it away now," Francis said, his arms wrapping around her waist, locking them both into the warm space of the window nook. "It's not a code to hide behind anymore. It's a monument." He reached out, his long fingers gently brushing the steel strings of the guitar where it lay. A low, beautiful, resonant chord ringed out through the quiet apartment, vibrating against the wooden sill and floating out into the open city air. He took his small leather ledger from his pocket and laid it on the sill right beside the guitar's neck. On the very last page, beneath his elegant, slanted script, he had drawn a small, neat musical stave. But instead of notes, he had simply written a final, permanent dedication. "Guitar by the Windowsill, an independent duet. Every piece of music has a sovereign note," Francis said, his voice a low, rich murmur against her ear as the midnight mist patterned the glass beside them. "The note that dictates the key of everything that follows it. For a long time, I thought mine was the standard pitch of a classical piano. But my sovereign note is your voice, Nicole, and as long as we have a window open to the world, this is where our harmony stays." Nicole smiled, her heart anchoring into a deep, unshakable peace. She turned in his arms, her fingers tangling in his hair, and pulled him down into a kiss that tasted of the open air, the summer rain, and a love that had finally outgrown the boundaries of the page. Outside, the clock tower of the university chimed the hour, its distant notes swallowed by the vastness of the city. But inside the room, lit by the moon and framed by the dark wood of the frame, the guitar by the windowsill remained silent, safe, and beautifully triumphant in the light. The end.